Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, guests. I would like to welcome you to this very important event, a very unique event, really, because we are privileged to have a number of experts, of Ukrainian experts and South African experts in the room, which creates conditions for very unique conversation, I think. I would like to just mention a few housekeeping rules before we begin. Please, for our online audience, please keep your mics and cameras off. Otherwise, you'll be reminded to do so by our moderators. Please also, if you want to ask a question, please write in the chat function, and the question will be asked during the Q&A. For the sake of this event, what we thought would be good is to divide it into three sections, and we will start with a set of presentations by our South African and Ukrainian experts on their ongoing research, and they will present some of the key takeaways from their research, which should be quite interesting. We will then hear from our colleague Priyal Singh, senior researcher at the ISS, who will provide his analysis, perspective, and reflections on his ongoing work and the presentations, and then we will move into Q&A. So, colleagues, with that being said, I would like to first ask my colleague Piers Pigu, the head of the Southern African program, to deliver some introductory remarks on behalf of the ISS. Thank you.
Dennis, thank you very much, and a big welcome to all of you in the room and online. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I should just explain that maybe briefly why the head of the Southern Africa program is up here. Just to explain that in the configuration of structural dynamics at the Institute for Security Studies, our specific point work stream on issues relating to Ukraine falls under what we call the Africa in the World project, and Africa in the World is tucked under the Southern Africa program, even though obviously the mandate and the stretch of the interests of the work goes way beyond the Southern Africa arena. So it's a kind of it's a practical arrangement that we have at the moment, but nevertheless it's been extremely fortuitous for me on a personal level to be able to engage on these kinds of issues, to learn much more about the situation in Ukraine and the role of the African continent in engaging on this particular subject matter. This situation is an extremely important one for the Institute for Security Studies, and we are investing a fair amount of time and energy in various work activities on the Ukraine file. And my colleague, I'm sure, Priyal Singh, who will talk later, will reflect on some of these issues. I'd like to say just briefly, because there's a lot of speakers and I don't want to take up your time, thank you very much for coming today. This is a seminar co-hosted by several organizations, and we welcome you to the Institute. Not only ourselves, of course, the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. Very nice to see you, Cheryl, back in old ground for you, your familiar territory. The Democratic Initiatives Foundation, the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation, and last but not least, the Ukrainian Association for South Africa. These are all your hosts today. So I'm not going to take up any more of your time. So thank you very much. I hope the conversations are fruitful. I'm afraid I'm stuck in a all-day meeting on the microdynamics of the insurgency in Mozambique, but I'm sure if there's any lessons from this process for that one, we will hear about it. So thank you very much. Back to you, Dennis.
Thank you very much, Piers. I would now like to call Dzvinka Kacher from the Ukrainian Association in South Africa to also deliver a brief introductory remarks and tell us a little bit more about the project. Dzvinka, please have the floor.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks a lot for hosting this event. Indeed, in June 2023, the group of African leaders have conducted the peace mission to Ukraine and Russia to try and resolve the conflict and the war that has started in 2014 and went into the full-scale invasion in 2022. And while one might wonder why leaders of African continent have decided for the first time to go beyond the continent and address the conflict that is outside of the continent, I think there are obvious reasons for that. Firstly, it's the scale of this war. There are more than 400,000 soldiers on the ground. The territory that is affected is more than 600,000 square kilometers. And also there are more than 6,000 missiles that are targeting this territory. So obviously the outcome of that is financial flows, food security, environmental impact are massive, and unfortunately African continent is significantly negatively affected. Secondly, it's the fact that this war is waged between the country with nuclear weapon against the countries that have decided voluntarily to give up nuclear weapons. Because Ukraine used to have world's third largest nuclear arsenal, and in 1994 voluntarily joined non-proliferation movement, while the United States, UK, and Russia took on responsibility to protect its sovereign borders. So for African continent, where majority of states are part of the Pelindaba Treaty, this poses significant risk that none of the countries that are part of non-proliferation treaty can defend their borders. So it sends a very dangerous message that would probably take us further into militarization from sustainable development goals. And thirdly, it is the first time that the permanent member of UN Security Council is trying to annex territory of another state whose borders previously were not contested. So because of this unique situation and because its impact not only on the governments but on ordinary citizens, the South African civil society organization have decided to respond to it. And as mentioned previously, Institute of Justice and Reconciliation, Desmond and Leah Tutu Foundation, Democratic Initiative Foundation, and the Ukrainian Association of South Africa have put a platform together for experts from Ukraine and South Africa to work on 3 specific areas. And those areas are regional security, nuclear safety, and forceful deportation of children. So all those 3 topics have direct connection to the continent, and the outcome of this work would be 3 policy briefs on those topics. And collective of authors is working not to solve only the issue of peace in Ukraine, but to build a society that is safer for both, for development of African continent and also for ensuring long-lasting just peace in Ukraine. So today we will hear experts that are working in 2 of those groups. Earlier today, at the University of Pretoria, we had a session on the forceful deportation of children. It is recorded and will be at the Ukrainian Association webpage. So if you would like to listen to it, please do so. The topic of forceful deportation of children has been specifically mentioned by President Ramaphosa during his visit to St. Petersburg, where he said that all children have to be returned to their homes. And all members of African Peace Mission have reiterated that this is one of the points that they would like to work towards, so that all Ukrainian children are returned back home. Currently, there are more than 19,500 of identified children that are looking for going back to their families. So I'll stop on that. Thanks a lot. And also, because the policy briefs are not yet finalized, we welcome any suggestions as well as critical questions that will help us to think about new challenges that we can, or new ways how we can address those issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Drika. Thank you for outlining the project and the framework for what we're discussing today. And with that being said and with that being out of the way, I would like to invite our speakers to join me at the panel. If you could please proceed to the arrangement. So we have two clusters of speakers, let's call it that will address two separate topics, and we will start with the work that is being done on a sort of international security architecture and the just peace research, which should be quite interesting. We often hear about the sort of material implications of the war in Ukraine, and to see how it affects Africa, for instance, in a broader way would be quite interesting. So I would like to invite, I don't know if you want to do it here or to the podium. I would like to invite Dr. Maxim Yakovlev. Dr. Maxim is the head of the Department of International Relations and Director of School for Policy Analysis at the National University of Kyiv Academy, which is one of the oldest universities in Ukraine, founded in 1615. He's also a member of the Public Council at the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, and Dr. Yakovlev holds a PhD from National Academy of Science of Ukraine. Dr. Yakovlev, please, you have the floor, yeah?
Thank you very much. I'm pleased and honored, and I'm a bit nervous, of course, to speak to such a distinguished audience. So it is my pleasure to be for the first time on the African continent, and I'm glad that it's exactly in South Africa, and also this distinguished and very well-known center for research in many things that we also do and find important in Ukraine. So before we start, I would like to note and emphasize that this is a very collaborative undertaking between the Ukrainian side and South African side and the number of researchers. We collaborated online, we discussed the paper, and it's always a pleasure to come to a place and meet people physically in person, those who are working with on similar topics. Okay, so the first introduction I would like to say why we find it very important to talk about issues of regional security architecture and changes is that I believe that now, when the war of Russia against Ukraine is ongoing, we have this opportunity to rethink, reimagine, and also change the world architecture of security for a better and more secure world. This is a window of opportunity we have to use, because there are many things that happened and many things that also led to this invasion and to things that are happening, and there are many things about the world architecture of security that we need to change. I also would like to stress that even we Ukrainians, from our perspective, were not aware how important Ukraine is, for example, for the African continent, in terms of food supply, fertilizers, and many other things. So we realized it first when the war happened and this change of supply broke. We again realized how globalized this world is, and it might seem that Ukraine and South Africa are far away, but there are many things that are in common for us. There are many experiences that we share. There are many things that we can also build upon. So first is the United Nations Organization and Security Council. In our paper, we also highlight and indicate that if you take a look at how the General Assembly is voting on issues of invasion, war, and things like that, you see there is almost a unanimity on terms of that invasion is bad, that actually invading a neighboring country and breaking the rules, all possible international rules, is a bad idea. But then if you compare how the Security Council works, where you have powers that hold the veto right, and basically that can veto any decision taken, you start thinking about how come we're living now in the world where the security architecture is based on the result of the Second World War. And I would also claim that, as many scholars do, that at the very moment the Security Council was composed back then after the Second World War, it was already back then, it was a bit obsolete in terms of what it proved. My students usually ask me this question because I was surprised, how come not a single African country is then the Security Council? How come we live in the world where this architecture does not correspond to the current need? And I always stress this idea that it is not about our Ukrainian position that if we had any African country, let alone South Africa, that we will be sure that we'll get the support. It's not about that. We are sure that we need a more diverse security architecture, where important countries are on the board and where African continent is well presented. I can tell you from my personal experience, yesterday we visited 3 places. It was the Constitutional Hill, and we also had a chance to look into the court session, to look how it works. We went around to see the cells and all this the monument. We went also to Nelson Mandela House, which was very interesting. And of course, Apartheid Museum, where when you buy the ticket, they already kind of qualify you into whites, not whites. It is a very interesting experience. So there are a lot of things we can learn from South African experience, how to bring about a more safer world in which all nations are respected and no violation of borders or infringement upon it would be left unpunished. It is extremely important for us. Then, of course, as we know, there is also something we share in common is what Ms. Zwinka-Kaczor mentioned is our experience with nuclear weapons. We gave it up. We had the 3rd largest arsenal in the world, and also South African experience and the role in non-proliferation. As you might know now, Russians probably already have the nukes in the Belarus, in the neighboring country, which is for the first time where they have nuclear weapons spreading around the globe. We need to stop that, and there must be mechanisms developed to somehow actually work against it. Of course, the territorial integrity of the disputes and the way to resolve them, for that we need a new and more viable and effective mechanisms also on the level of international organizations. That's why reforming United Nations Security Council is very important, extending it and adding African voices to it. With territorial integrity, just to give this example that we highlight in our paper, territories that were occupied by the Russian military from the day they announced the referendum to the day that they officially declared it to be part of Russia, also including the territories that have never been occupied by Russia, it took just 9 days. We all understand that in 9 days you can do no proper work, no proper referendum, it's just a mocking of any rules. So the point I'm making now is that for territorial integrity and for the rules of international law to be respected, it's very important that we highlight these things and we develop different types of approaches on how to deal with that. So as Ms. Zwinka-Kaczor mentioned, our work is work in progress. We're taking these cases and examples, we are reflecting upon them. And as I said in the beginning of my speech, there are many things that we can share from our experience and we can reflect and dwell upon them. So to highlight my topics is, I do believe that especially if we compare these votings in the General Assembly of the United Nations and the Security Council, of course, there are voices we can sometimes hear, well, why do we need United Nations organization? This organization does nothing. But this is the security potential that we can use. I think that we are not using this organization fully. We don't use the potential that is there. So to finish with something funny to amuse you a bit, last year I published a book on not on security, but on conspiracy theories. It's a non-fiction book. And it is about different conspiracies, of course, also from the perspective of Ukraine and the post-Soviet space as such. And I give you this example that in the States, there is a conspiracy theory that United Nations are taking over the American government, that they're really there, to conquer the world. Everybody in Ukraine is laughing at it, saying, okay, but if this organization is so omnipotent, why is that it cannot prevent wars, prevent atrocities across the globe? And it's not about getting rid of this organization, but using its full potential. In one of the ways which we are claiming in our paper is by extending and reforming the Security Council, by making Africa, this particular South Africa, a part of the security architecture, which will definitely bring about opportunity to make this world a safer place for us all, and to make this world to have at least a future for us all in the future with security in a safer place. So our draft, we're working this paper, everybody's welcome to comment on it, and I'm sure that this is not the end of our interesting Ukrainian-South African collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxim. I think it sets up the discussion for Q&A very well, especially because, I think everyone understands, generally speaking, that the international system is broken, it doesn't work, but it seems that everyone has own ideas about how to approach fixing it. So it would be an interesting conversation. But we're very privileged today to have Professor Cheryl Hendrick with us, and of course she's executive director of the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. She specializes in gender, peace, and security initiatives, and she currently leads the Static Gender Protocol Alliance of Gender, Peace, and Security cluster. I might have.
I don't believe that.
I retract this statement. Colleagues, the bios are also printed in for your convenience to familiarize yourself. But please Professor Hendricks, you have the floor.
Thank you, Program Director, members of the diplomatic community, our partners in this initiative, participants. Always great to be here at the ISS and to have a discussion here with you today. IJR has been in partnership with the four organizations working on this particular policy brief. It has primarily been my colleague, Prof. Tim Maruthi. He couldn't make it here today, so I am here. But I have my own opinions, and that's what I will present, I indicated. So I think our conversation here today is about possible pathways for peace between Ukraine and Russia, but more broadly to discuss reforming the global and regional peace and security architectures, as the continued conflict is a symptom of the dysfunction of these institutions. The invasion of both Ukraine and of Gaza has once more brought up the discussion on the reform of our peace and security architectures because of their seeming inability to ensure collective security, to ensure the peaceful resolution of disputes, and adherence to international laws and norms. Many see the increase in intra and interstate conflicts as creating a window of opportunity for transforming these bodies. Usually at points of major disruption, World War I, World War II, and or when security organs are no longer fit for purpose, they are transformed or adapted accordingly. The big question then, is this a moment when the status quo has been sufficiently disrupted to produce alterations of our security architectures? Or will we merely continue to point to the need for reform and have a limited discussion about the membership of the UN Security Council? I would venture to argue that we cannot reset or reimagine our security architectures in isolation of much deeper discussions on how we wish to coexist in future. The principles, the values, policies and processes that will enable us to realize this peace that we want, and the vehicles or organs or structures that will be the bearers of an inclusive collective security, which we have all been party to shaping and by whose new rules we all agree to live by. So let me first briefly focus on the invasion of Ukraine and the possible settlement of this dispute. The invasion of Ukraine is now entering its third year, and it shows no signs of abate. Africa, as we are all well aware, has been affected by the food and energy shortages. And we sent a peace mission there. We developed a 10-point proposal. Ukraine then, a few months later, developed their own formula, which was also 10 points. And our African countries, including South Africa, that led the delegation, continue with behind-the-scenes negotiations, but the war continues too. I don't want to reflect on who is right and who is wrong, and that, because I don't believe war is right in any context. And I don't believe it's a discourse that actually moves us forward to resolving the conflict. I think that there's precisely a war because there are entrenched positions. In all conflicts, there are differing narratives of what is transpiring and why it is transpiring. And this conflict is no different. For us, it is about ending, and us as peace builders, it is about ending all wars in as peaceful a manner as possible. To do so, we need to unpack the causes, the different narratives, but mostly get to identifying the different interests and to see how best these can be met, and yes, with compromises on both sides. My knowledge about this conflict does not extend to the depth of analysis of yours, and so I'm not going to go there except by a cursory glance of these 10-point proposals. Because it does seem to me that there are different narratives and interests, that there's little common ground, and that at this point, both still seem to want to settle this conflict on the battlefield. And so here we will say that February 2014, we see the annexation of Crimea, and the narrative then was about an expansionist Russia, one seeking to rebuild its empire. There was no UN or regional security structure that stopped this from happening. Then in February 2022, the realists portrayed the cause of the war again as due to NATO's expansionism, a perceived security threat for Russia itself. Russia itself noted that it would be a matter of time before NATO placed missiles in Ukraine. But its main discourse, I think, was around defending the Russian-speaking people in the Donbas region, in whatever imagination it sought there. On the other hand, then we had a discourse from Ukraine around an attack on its sovereignty and its very identity of a country. It wanted to enact the right of self-determination granted to it, as it does for all other countries that have gained their independence. And so it sought to fight back in the form of a just war, and invokes Article 2 of the UN Charter for doing so. We all know Article 2. It has mobilized its people and it has rallied for international support in this regard. But I think the cost of the war on both sides, irrespective of the narratives, the cost of the war is high. Indeed, both victims and perpetrators of war pay a very heavy price, not only economically and in the loss of life and destruction of infrastructure, but in their very woundedness, the hate for each other that begins to manifest, the trauma of the war, and so forth. And this is why we must always include transitional justice reconciliation and healing as a fundamental part of our peace-building processes. War does not end when the guns are silenced or when peace agreements are signed. They end only when we have meaningful transformation of relationships and redress of the things that gave rise to war and the justice that you speak of in the first place. And so for me, the larger question is, how do we get both countries to agree to a ceasefire and to a peace deal that will ensure that they both feel safe, secure, and can thrive to their full potential, and where there has been a measure of accountability for the atrocities committed during that war, or this war. As peace builders, I think that is our responsibility. And for us, whether it's the African Peace Mission or other peace builders, it's our active listening here, not trying to prejudge things, but listening to both sides and trying to see where the commonalities could possibly be found, where confidence building measures could possibly be found. And right now, it seems to be around the release of prisoners and around the issue of returning the children. But are there any more confidence-building measures that we can begin to put forward here? Clearly, here, this has to be part of a larger discussion around the reform of NATO, first and foremost, because these binary discourses that we have seen emerging, they're coming from that particular organization as well, almost a Cold War discourse that came into play, but more broadly within the UN as a whole, because our agenda for peace, the old and the new, are not working for us any longer, not because of a lack of diversity of the UN Security Council, although that should happen, that's a given, but because the nature of our conflicts themselves have changed, and the conflict actors that we have now are actually not concerned with the myriad of resolutions that are generated in the UN Security Council, because they don't have the capability of actually enforcing them. And so for me, I think, because you are walking closer, and I had a long thing about how to transform the UN Security Council, I want to make the important point, because if this is a moment of opportunity, it's not about tinkering with the UN Security Council or other regional security architectures, whether that is NATO or the African Union. It is about bringing us together to have an in-depth conversation of what are the new values, the new principles, the new processes that will take us forward to be able to coexist more peacefully in the current climate. How do we get to that just, equitable, democratic societies and global order that we all aspire to. I'm going to end there by saying that, yes, there is a window, but the window is only slightly open. As civil society and government, we need to push it wide open and begin to have those particular discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this, and thank you for mentioning, I think, two very specific things, that the fact that we need dialogue, we need discussions, we need to also listen to each other and have this conversation, but also thank you for raising the issue of African Peace Mission. I think it was such an underappreciated initiative. It was such a unique initiative too, in many ways. So I think it deserves to be mentioned. Colleagues, from now, we will change the topic a little bit, but we're still discussing the war in Ukraine and its impact, but we're looking at a slightly different perspective. So we'd like to invite our other colleagues looking at nuclear safety, and I would like to start with Ms. Elena Lepenko. Ms. Lepenko is an energy security expert at the Ukrainian think tank Dixie Group, and she's working on issues related to strengthening Ukrainian energy resilience and the security of energy resource supplies. She's also an external consultant to the Ministry of Energy of Ukraine. Ms. Lepenko, please take the floor. Apologize for technical issues.
I'm really happy to be here today and share information about Ukraine and learn something from you and exchange our experience. I brought a short presentation here, and we can start from some notes about the situation in Ukraine. Before the full-scale invasion, Ukraine operated 4 nuclear power plants, which provided electricity for up to 60% of the country's needs. Additionally, the Chernobyl exclusion zone, where in 1986 accident occurred, contaminated 145,000 square kilometers of territory, remains potentially hazardous area. Currently, there is centralized storage for spent nuclear facility. This site is here, the north part of Ukraine. The territory of the exclusion zone was occupied on the first day of the invasion, and it remained under occupation for 36 days. Throughout this period, numerous shellings and damage to power lines were recorded, leaving facilities within the exclusion zone without electricity supply. Also, in an updated statement by the Director General of the IAEA, dated February 26, 2022, it was reported that radiation levels in this site had increased by 20 times. However, the greatest threat remains the occupation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest in Europe, housing 6 VVER 1000 type reactors. It is right here. You can see it is occupied territory of Ukraine in the south part. Reports from the IAEA document numerous violations of nuclear safety at the facility, including 3 complete blackouts in 2023. Representatives of the IAEA have noted inadequate technical maintenance and repairs, as well as the presence of weapons, explosives, and military equipment there. There is a shortage of qualified personnel at the facility, and those remaining workers who are Ukrainian citizens feel unprecedented psychological pressure. Cases of physical violence and torture were recorded there. Rafael Grossi, Director General of the IAEA, reports that the number of personnel at the station has been cut in half. In 2024, the 6-year operational term of nuclear fuel at all 6 units of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant will expire, raising concerns about the risks involved in removing the nuclear fuel assemblers without incident. Additionally, the Russian side continuously declares its intention to put the power plant into operation. However, 4 of the units have American Westinghouse fuel control and management system installed, which Russians are unable to operate. Moreover, operating the plant's production capacities will require substantial amount of water for cooling the reactors from the pools. However, obtaining this water has become challenging after the Russians' attack on the Kakhovska hydropower plant and the destruction of the dam. Initial steps toward with nuclear safety have been taken at the IAEA level. Since September 1st, 2022, a permanent mission has been operational, monitoring the condition of acceptable facilities. IAEA representatives are power plants in Ukraine. They provide daily and long-term reports on the situation in Ukraine. On March 7, 2024, the IAEA's Board of Governors supported a draft resolution on nuclear safety, security, and guarantees in Ukraine, underscoring the demand of the immediate return of the power plant under the full control of Ukrainian authorities. This documentation at the IAEA level outlines the fastest route to achieving nuclear safety. Similar resolutions were adopted earlier. In particular, on September 28 last year. However, these appeals are completely ignored by the Russian side. However, this represents only the initial phase. Moving forward requires additional efforts to develop and agree upon practical measures that not only emphasize the necessity of meeting nuclear safety requirements, but also compel all parties to adhere to them fully. I want to emphasize that South Africa is currently the only country on the continent operating a nuclear power plant. South Africa, like Ukraine, is also a member of the IAEA's Board of Governors. That's why we see South Africa as a regional leader in matters of nuclear safety, as many African countries intend to develop nuclear energy technologies here. Therefore, our collective voices and efforts should contribute to the development of effective tools to ensure nuclear safety in Ukraine and prevent similar threats in other countries worldwide. It is very important for us that the Republic of South Africa supports the Ukrainian peace formula, which includes radiation and nuclear safety. The problem of threats to nuclear safety cannot be solved at the national level. That's why effective regional and especially global cooperation is crucial. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena. I think thank you for providing this context. And I personally am not an expert in this field, and it was quite interesting to hear about the situation and to understand some of the dynamics. I would like to now invite Ms. Isabel Bosman. She's a researcher in SAI's African Governance and Diplomacy Program. Her research centers on the nexus between technology and politics. And she works on the Atom 4 Development Project, which focuses on the peaceful use of nuclear energy in Africa and issues of nuclear energy governance. Ms. Bosman, please, you have the floor.
There you go. Thanks so much. Thank you for the kind introduction, and again, thank you to the organizers and our previous speakers for very excellent presentations. I'm going to add to my colleague Alena's presentation and focus a little bit more on the regional African nuclear security architecture. Why won't my slides move? There we go. So I'm going to start my presentation with a section just on terminology briefly, before moving into the African nuclear regulatory framework, and then looking at international law and the protection it affords to nuclear installations. And then I will end with briefly the IAEA's response to the occupation of nuclear power plants in Ukraine. So starting with this issue of terminology, I just thought it's important to sort of contextualize why the issue of the occupation of firstly Chernobyl and then Zaporizhzhia is so serious. And I'm drawing there on the IAEA's, that's the International Atomic Energy Agency's definitions of two key terms, nuclear safety and nuclear security. It defines nuclear safety as the achievement of proper operating conditions, prevention of accidents, and mitigation of accident consequences, resulting in protection of workers, the public, and the environment from undue radiation risks. Nuclear security, on the other hand, is defined as the prevention and detection of and response to criminal or intentional unauthorized acts involving or directed at nuclear material, other radioactive material, associated facilities, or associated activities. I'm just going to play a bit of karaoke with my slides. You'd think I would have this memorized by now, but I don't. So I've highlighted this because what I'm trying to demonstrate is that there's a clear kind of threat and response in what the IAEA has done and is doing based on its own definitions and understanding of these terms. So quickly focusing on the African nuclear regulatory framework. So it's important to note, firstly, that non-proliferation, safety and security, that's nuclear safety and security, are deeply embedded in the nuclear regulatory framework of the African continent. And this is because, mostly going back to independence, African states have been and still are strong supporters of the peaceful uses of nuclear science and technology, and they recognize the significant contribution that it can make to achieving development goals. So the continent supports several international regulatory frameworks related to nuclear safety and security, non-proliferation and disarmament. It is not limited to the ones I have listed, but just briefly to state, all but one African state is supported to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. The TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, has widespread support on the continent. So does the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, although sadly, one of the Annex II states that is preventing this treaty from entering into force is an African state, but nevertheless, there is widespread support on the continent for the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Then the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials, and then, of course, various IAEA safeguards and other initiatives that runs in cooperation and partnership between the IAEA, the AU, and African countries. But outside of that, the continent also has a robust homegrown nuclear regulatory framework and institutions that complement and often actually surpass the international frameworks to which it belongs. So here my key focus is going to be on AFRA, the FNRBA, and then the one I really want to draw your attention to, the Treaty of Pelindaba and its implementation body, the African Commission on Nuclear Energy, AFCON. So AFRA, that is the African Regional Cooperation Agreement for Research, Training and Development related to nuclear science and technology. This actually entered into force before the Pelindaba Treaty on the 4th of April 1990. And its aim is to support socio-economic development on the continent through nuclear science and technology. As its mission statement, AFRA says it aims to be the leading regional organization in Africa and vehicle of the member states for the effective promotion and coordination of peaceful applications of nuclear science and technology for socio-economic development on the continent. And then specifically mentioned in Article 8.3 of the Treaty of Pelindaba is AFRA, This article reads, parties are encouraged to make use of the program of assistance available in the IAEA and in this connection to strengthen cooperation under AFRA. Then moving on briefly to the FNRBA, that is the Forum of Nuclear Regulatory Bodies in Africa. It was established in 2009 and it actually forms part of the IAEA's Global Nuclear Security and Safety Network. It was established with the goal to enhance, strengthen, and harmonize the radiation protection, nuclear safety and security regulatory infrastructure and framework among the FNRBA members. It has, over many years, hosted several successful training workshops across the continent, and it's active across the following 6 thematic areas: legislative and regulatory infrastructure, radiation and waste safety, nuclear safety infrastructure, emergency preparedness and response, transport safety infrastructure, and nuclear security infrastructure. So there's really this kind of emphasis on the practical implementation needing the strong regulatory legal framework. The FNRBA's 2021-2022 action plan was focused on overseeing the safety and security of radioactive material, the development of regulations for securing these sources, including transport security exercise, FNRBA working group meetings, a regional workshop on a nuclear security culture, and a survey on the status of the radioactive material of the various FNRBA members. And then, most importantly, is the African Nuclear Weapon Free Zone Treaty, or as it is more commonly known, the Treaty of Pelindaba. And you will see on the left just a map that I have compiled and shared on some of my social media of the status of the Pelindaba Treaty on the continent. So you will see that there's a total of 52 signatories and 44 states parties. The Treaty of Pelindaba opened for signature in 1996 and it entered into force in 2009. Under the Pelindaba Treaty, Africa is declared one of only 3 nuclear weapon-free zones in the world. And the treaty prohibits the research, development, production, housing, stockpiling, etc. of nuclear weapons. But I want to draw your attention to 2 important provisions in the treaty, and that is firstly Article 10, which relates to the physical protection of nuclear materials and facilities. Under Article 10, each of the state parties to the Pelindaba Treaty undertake to maintain the highest standards of security and effective physical protection of nuclear materials, facilities, and equipment to prevent, importantly, theft or unauthorized use and handling. To that end, each party undertakes to apply measures of physical protection equivalent to those provided for in the Convention of Physical Protection of Nuclear Material and in recommendations and guidelines developed by the IAEA for this purpose. And what that really demonstrates is this constant interplay in the homegrown nuclear regulatory framework between African states' support for and respect for the international conventions, which also is reflected in the regional nuclear security architecture. But then importantly, and this is a really unique element of the Treaty of Pelindaba, and that is Article 11, relating to the prohibition of armed attack on nuclear installations. Under Article 11, each party undertakes not to take or assist or encourage any action aimed at an armed attack by conventional or other means against nuclear installations in the African Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone. Under the Treaty of Pelindaba was also established the African Commission on Nuclear Energy, AFCON. It is the implementation body of the Treaty of Pelindaba, and it is also very active on the continent and in global forums in promoting one of the pillars of the NPT, the peaceful uses pillar, which in some circles is often forgotten, but to then also be active in the non-proliferation space. Then moving on from the regional framework, I'd like to just briefly reflect on international law and the protection of nuclear installations. So currently, there isn't a multilateral treaty that governs the protection of nuclear installations against armed attack like Pelindaba does. But that does not mean that nuclear installations are not protected under international law, because they are, and strongly so. So what we do have is a set of customary international law mechanisms to protect nuclear installations from armed attack. These are firstly the 2 additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions of 1949, and then the rules of international humanitarian law. And because there is no multilateral binding treaty specifically preventing armed attack, this customary law carries a significant amount of weight in this space. I'm just taking an opportunity to promote something else, but I have written a policy brief explaining that somewhat more and relating to the occupation of Zaporizhzhia, titled Legal Protection for Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant, Matters for Nuclear Installations Everywhere, if anyone would like to read that. So I'm just going to draw your attention briefly to rule number 42 of the Rules of International Humanitarian Law. It says that particular care must be taken if works and installations containing dangerous forces, namely dams, dikes, and nuclear electrical generating stations, and other installations located at or in their vicinity are attacked in order to avoid the release of dangerous forces and consequent severe losses among the population. And then to also draw your attention to Article 15 of Additional Protocol 2 to the Geneva Conventions and Article 56(1) of the additional protocol, the first additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions. It states that works or installations containing dangerous forces, namely dams, dikes, and nuclear electrical generating stations, shall not be made the object of attack, even where these objects are military objectives, if such attack may cause the release of dangerous forces and consequent severe losses among the civilian population. Other military objectives located at or in the vicinity of these works or installations shall also not be made the object of attack if such attack may cause the release of dangerous forces from the works or installations and consequent severe losses among the population. Now, since the occupation of Zaporizhzhia, there's been some scholarly debate on the exact language used here, and that comes down to the terms may cause. And one of the questions there becomes in whose assessment. So that's important to highlight just in that context. And just in closing, I see Dennis is stepping closer. I just want to briefly reflect on the IAEA's response to the occupation of nuclear power plants in Ukraine. I'm not going into exact detail on what this has entailed. There are several very detailed reports published by the IAEA following their own review and inspection missions on this. But what we have seen includes several statements, emergency meetings, and the reports I mentioned on the situation in the ground in both Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia. There have been several safety and security inspections, many of which were actually led by the IAEA's Director General, Rafael Mariano Grossi himself. And then, as Olena also mentioned in her presentation, there are IAEA experts permanently stationed at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, as well as other nuclear facilities in Ukraine in a monitoring role. That's also important to highlight, as the Director General himself has done, to remind people that there are other nuclear facilities in Ukraine that are subject or at risk of the same kind of threats and consequences. There's also been IAEA technical support and assistance, the delivery of critical equipment, briefings to the Security Council, as well as the General Assembly, where they called for an end to shelling near the plant. And then importantly, although this has not yet been implemented, calls from the IAEA for the creation of a nuclear safety and security protection zone around Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. I've included a brief quote there from the IAEA Director General on the situation at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. He called the situation unprecedented and said that it is the first time a military conflict has occurred amid the facilities of a large established nuclear power program. A nuclear accident can have serious impacts within the country and beyond its borders. And I've included that there because it relates to what I will conclude my presentation with. Although this is the first time that this situation is being experienced, it has not been unimagined. There have been concerns raised about this exact situation for many years, and is also probably why you will find Article 11 in the Treaty of Pelindaba, because it is such a very real possibility that nuclear installations could be at risk in the case of armed conflict. So I want to end with asking what more can be done in terms of the IAEA's, but also the broader multilateral systems response. And I want to leave you with two thoughts there. And the first is that we need greater follow-through and political will to do what is necessary. So I'm again going back into the IAEA's own history to the General Conference Resolution 533 of October 1990, where it said, the General Conference, aware of the fact that an armed attack on a nuclear installation could result in radioactive releases with grave consequences within and beyond the boundaries of the state which has been attacked, convinced of the need to prohibit armed attacks on nuclear installations from which such releases could occur, and of the urgency of concluding an international agreement in this regard, and aware of the ongoing work of the Conference on Disarmament with a view to concluding an international agreement in this regard, 1, recognizes that attacks or threats of attack on nuclear facilities devoted to peaceful purposes could jeopardize the development of nuclear energy. And then secondly, considers that the safeguard system of the agency is a reliable means of verifying the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. This then goes on to point number 7, where all states are urged to cooperate in achieving a successful resolution of the issue in the near future. And what I want to kind of emphasize there as part of the kind of overarching theme of this conference and Africa's role in a lasting peace is that this is perhaps also an opportunity to strengthen the international legal framework on prohibiting armed attacks against nuclear installations. There are some experts who would say that yet another treaty is not necessarily going to make a difference, because then people can sort of pick and choose which frameworks they adhere to or not. And then I want to link that to my last point on recognizing limitations. While myself and other experts do praise the Treaty of Pelindaba for Article 11, we've never had to see that sort of exercised in practice. So there's no kind of bench line to say this is how a state that violates that treaty obligation will be treated. And then, of course, as we know, international law is quite hard to enforce. So we've never had to see that enforcement in practice, but nevertheless, there are lessons to be learned. Because if you go back into the history of Article 11, there was some protest to it at the time when the treaty was put together from states outside of Africa, and Africans persisted and left it in as they conceptualized it. And then also just looking at limitations of the IAEA, it has a strict mandate within which it can operate, and in many instances, it has to rely on the permission of the state affected. So Zaporizhzhia was occupied on the 4th of March, but the IAEA only gained access on the 1st of September. And I'm going to end it there. And I thank you for your attention, and hope I gave you something to think about.
Thank you, Reva. Certainly a lot to think about. You also mentioned something about the international treaties and it's all very good until they actually need to be implemented in practice, and then you realize the language is crafted in a very specific way. But without further ado, and we are colleagues a bit behind the schedule, let me call in Mr. Priya Singh to deliver his response to the presentation that we heard today. Please join.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you to the panelists for your presentations. I don't have any particular speaking notes. I'm simply responding to what's been presented. So with these kinds of exercises, it's always difficult to know where to begin. Maybe I'll begin with a general blanket apology especially to our colleagues from Ukraine and Ukrainians based in South Africa, that I think it's important for us to always remain cognizant of the fact that, us within think tanks and within academia often are researching conflict as it's, hot conflicts that are currently ongoing. And I think it's important for us to remain cognizant of the fact that why we are all here is the fact that there is a conflict at the moment, and that we remain committed towards the end of that conflict. And all of the research that we've been doing and all of the policy briefs and research papers that we're putting out are in some small way trying to spur on a discussion as to how we can tangibly make a small contribution towards ending that conflict. And secondly, I'd also like to mention again to our friends from Ukraine that it is, of course, we are cognizant of the fact that it is not an easy thing to have your country spoken about by third parties, by countries around the world, in which there's such a great proximity, distance to your country. So it must not be an easy thing, and for that, we are cognizant that this is a difficult issue for you. So colleagues, from the presentations that have been made, I think maybe what I'll do is I'll begin with the comments made on the nuclear issue and also around reform of the global multilateral security order, because this really is the elephant in the room. I mean, going beyond the protection of nuclear power plants, the fact that we have a nuclear-armed state, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, in many ways makes this an unprecedented issue that we are dealing with as the international community. The fact that Russia has an incredible nuclear arsenal at its disposal, it seems pretty open towards increasingly open towards using that nuclear arsenal, and the fact that it is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, all in many ways directly impacts on the likelihood of any Security Council reform. I think that remains a pipe dream where we are right now. It impacts on the geopolitics of the global security environment. It impacts on the trajectory and direction and nature of reform of the global multilateral system itself. So this really is the elephant in the room, because again, as academics, as think tankers, we can put forward ideas and recommendations on how to incrementally move the needle on these big global issues relating to reform of the Security Council, what an emergent international order or rules-based international order could look like. But the fact remains that when you have countries with nuclear arsenals that sit at the highest decision-making bodies in the world and are willing to use those weapons, everything remains deadlocked. So we need to remain cognizant of that. And I'm glad that we are having this conversation here in South Africa at the moment, given South Africa's kind of unique place in the world when it comes to nuclear non-proliferation. The second issue I'd like to talk about is, again, relating to proximity. We are many, many, many kilometers away from Kyiv and from Moscow here in Pretoria. And again, the question remains, why is this important for Africa? Why is this important for African countries? There are, I mean, if we had to just look at the African continent right now, the head of our Southern Africa program, Piers Pigu, just mentioned that he was rushing off to a meeting on Mozambique at the moment, where we have an ongoing insurgency there. We have South African peacekeepers in DRC. And then there's a conflict belt stretching all the way from the west coast of West Africa, all into the Horn of Africa, and everything in between is a zone of conflict and instability that we are all very much concerned about and are seeking to address on the African continent. So why does Ukraine feature so prominently? Or why should we be concerned with Ukraine? And again, we also live in a world in which more civilians have been killed in Gaza in just a short period of time than the entire civilian toll in Ukraine. And we have to be honest with these things, that we have to be honest with our answers, that there are some conflicts that are ongoing in which countries like South Africa are able to make a more meaningful contribution simply because of where we are positioned in the world, our experiences, and so on. But again, I come back to the question, why is Ukraine important? And the unfortunate answer is that the invasion of Ukraine has taken place at a particular moment in time that calls into question many of these larger issues about the nature of the international security order. And I'm going back to my first point that while we have to remain cognizant of the fact that there are real tolls to this conflict, that the war is ongoing, that people are suffering in Ukraine right now, countries like South Africa are seemingly more engaged on these bigger issues around the nature of the international order, broader geopolitical contestations that are playing out in the international order right now. Maybe this is because it's a function of proximity to Ukraine or proximity to Russia, but I would say it's also largely informed by the fact that South Africa's history, political history, and the political history of many African countries have naturally led them to find themselves only able to make a meaningful contribution in terms of these larger discussions on the geopolitical contestations that are ongoing. This is not to say that African states are not trying to make more tangible contributions towards a peace process. Last year we did have the African Peace Mission, in which a 10-point plan was put out. And of course, South Africa is actively contributing or engaging in the Ukrainian peace process by President Zelensky's office on the Ukrainian 10-point peace formula. And again, I think it's important for us to understand that one of the reasons why African states have sought to make these contributions, even beyond the bigger global issues, and specifically hone in on the actual negotiation process or the 10-point peace plan, is that, yes, there are tangible economic and security implications of the conflict that affect African states. Many of you are aware of the food security issues, energy security issues, knock-on issues relating from inflation and so on. And all of these, of course, do in many ways affect African countries, and they serve as conflict stresses in many of the existing conflicts that we are dealing with across the African continent at the moment. But I would also argue that I think it's so important that Africa makes a collective contribution to these issues, because beyond these tangible material impacts of the conflict on Africa, Africa has a voice in what an emergent international order could or should look like. And again, Ukraine represents the center of the geopolitical rifts that are opening up in the world right now. And that is why it is so important for African states to be involved and to take a position and to make active contributions to this process. Because what happens in Ukraine is going to ripple out across the international system, and it is going to have implications on the future global institutional order, rules-based order, and the makeup of an emergent international security order. And that is where African states cannot be absent. And this is precisely why we need a coherent and coordinated common African approach towards dealing with these issues. It's a very difficult thing to achieve, again, given all of the incredible challenges we face, again, going back to the fact that the aggressor in this case is a nuclear-armed P5 member. It's a very difficult thing to achieve, but it is, again, something that Africa cannot be absent from. And it is encouraging to see that African states are increasingly playing a role within official and unofficial forums to make a small contribution to the peaceful resolution of this conflict. Colleagues, moving forward, and I'll conclude here, Dennis, because I'd like to give as much time as we can towards questions from the audience. But I'll just conclude on just a few ideas on the way forward. Number one, when we look at the Ukrainian peace formula being coordinated by President Zelensky's office, we must remain cognizant that there are many lessons from Africa that we can take forward in moving that negotiation process forward. We are at quite a difficult period right now, given that the fact that we are 2 years since the war began, in which many countries, especially from the global south, are putting pressure on parties all around that there needs to be more direct negotiation between Moscow and Kiev. And I think we've hit that wall at the moment, where many countries are saying, yes, we will support the process, but we need to see tangible measures being taken for there to be more direct negotiation. Because anything we contribute to or say that does not lead in direct negotiations is ultimately not going anywhere. So I think that's the conundrum we face right now as the international community in providing support to Ukraine, in undertaking the research and analysis that we're trying to do, is that we're ultimately going to hit that wall. We're going to run up against that contradiction. And the sooner we directly confront that contradiction, I think that it would be for the better. And maybe final points I'll make, and again, this is a little bit of a controversial issue, but I'll say it in any case, just to start conversation from the audience. Apart from the fact that the aggressor, Russia, is a nuclear armed state, is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, something else that is very clearly happening right now is that we are seeing a revisionist interpretation of history and identity being played out. We are seeing an aggressive state attempting to rewrite history and deny the identity and the right to existence of another state. Beyond issues relating to, of course, very clear violations of Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty and very clear human rights abuses being committed, this is something else that I think is extremely perverse. A rewriting of history to write out of the history books the identity and right to exist of another people, of another nation state. And again, I think this is something that African states cannot bury their heads in the sand about. It is something we need to confront much more directly, much more boldly. It is something, we have to confront. And I'll conclude there. Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you very much, Priyo. Thank you for these reflections. They were quite useful, and I think they've signposted a few questions we can discuss. So, colleagues, we have about 15 minutes or so for Q&A. If there are any immediate reflections from the room that we can, I see there's a hand there. If you can just introduce yourself and your organization, and also just for everyone in attendance here or online, please remember this is not Chatham House rules, so people might quote you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I didn't intend to be the first one to speak, but here we are. My name is Gaurelo Marasha. I work for government, the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. So you imagine our presence here, very interesting and important issue for us to be engaging with. A couple of points, but preliminarily, looking at the topic and what we're discussing today, drawing lessons from the conflict, one thought of, let's look back at the approaches to the conflict and what has transpired thus far in addressing it, and what lessons can we draw from it. And one came to the thinking about linking it to the African Peace Initiative and what the African leaders had in mind at the time, and what Professor Shoro was saying and what Priyal mentioned, the listening, not prejudging of what is being put out there, but to hear from the protagonists, from the countries and the leaders of the countries that are affected by the conflict itself and what is coming out of there, to hear and then make interventions. And South Africa's approach, and together with the African leaders, has been that, and Priyal is right, that unless you have Russia and Ukraine talking to each other it will be extremely difficult to unblock. There's a lot of unresolved issues, and they vary. And the best way to address those is to have direct negotiations, as Priyal was saying. But also, linking to your reflections, Priya, let's look at the impact and the interest that the African leaders are having on this. And we always reflect on the double standards of the Security Council and what the global system is imperfect. It is imperfect, it's got a lot of challenges. I'm not sure that it is completely broken, but it's got serious shortfalls. If we were to have performance indicators, peace and security would be one having lower scores than the other areas, right? So the system is somewhat working in some areas, but peace and security, we can debate for decades. And the question there is, with the double standards and the selective application of international law is similarly a very serious problem. And let's remember that when we speak about the UN, member states of the UN make up the UN. The UN itself is not going to do anything about itself without the member states. Therefore, the political will, the commitment, the genuine discussions that are taking place at the UN and multilateral fora are extremely important. And the instruments are there. International law is there. International human rights law is there. The UN Charter is there. But is that being implemented to its fullest? And the answer we all know. That's why we're having the problems that we're having and the magnitude of the challenges we are having. And you've all touched on the issue of UN reform. It has always been there. And you're right, representation. We talk about African representation because that is the only continent that is not represented. But it does not mean that having everyone around the table will solve all the problems. Now we need to engage genuinely about what are the serious shortcomings of the global system. We all agree that if we were, well, I would love to believe that if we were to have a system, if we did not have, let me phrase it this way, if we did not have the system as we have currently, I think we would be worse off. I don't know how everyone will feel about that, but at least we do have something. And we need to work together in a coherent manner, as Priyal is saying, to fix those shortcomings and fix the system. And yes, we can add up, because there are evolving challenges. We're talking artificial intelligence and so forth. There are global trends. Things are constantly evolving, and we need to adapt and come up with other innovative ways to resolve those. So I thought that I can share those preliminarily in drawing the lessons. We cannot unblock this conflict unless there are direct negotiations. You are right, President Ramaphosa is talking to both President of Russia and of Ukraine, and it's precisely to unlock those. And we're drawing from our own experiences as well. And South Africa still believes that even with the most protracted and most difficult conflicts, for as long as you open, all it takes is to open the channel of communication and have those direct negotiations, you can make some headways. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is, I think, it's a good intervention. If perhaps I can take another one or two questions from the room, and then before passing the floor to. Apologize for that. Before passing the floor to our speakers.
Thank you, Dennis. I'm Jana from the ISS. Thank you. Apologies, I've been moderating online as well. So. Okay, this is better. Just a brief correction based on the UNSC reform and how these conversations have come to light. I think something that's really important to take note of that Dr. Maxine has raised with regards to these flaws that we are seeing emerging on different fronts, seeing the UNSC in a gridlock in numerous cases, like we have seen with the Israel-Hamas conflict, like we have seen in the case of Ukraine. And my question would be, how can we use these platforms in which we have these dialogues to constructively contribute towards creating more equitable international platforms? I know at the ISS we have the Elect the Council proposal, which is through numerous consultations a proposal that we have developed internally for UNSC reform, for example. But it would be interesting to also hear your reflections on how we can use these conversations to also put forward much for reform in the international space.
Thank you, colleagues. I see another question.
Thank you. I'm Annette Leonard, a consultant at the ISS. I want to start and make a comment, but also ask the panelists a question at Prial's last comment. You need to understand history to understand where Russia is coming from and where it is going. It is going backwards into imperialism, and it will not leave that ground. Even if the window, as Professor Hendricks mentioned, opens a little bit wider, Mr. Putin and the people around him will not give up on taking back Ukraine and making it part of Russia again. If you can tackle that issue, you've got a starting point. Otherwise, we will talk around the table and we are not going to make progress. If someone could comment on that, thank you.
Thank you. May I test the temperature in the room, whether there are questions brewing? Maybe not just yet, but otherwise perhaps we can sort of move to closing the meeting and perhaps take the conversation. Perhaps in that case.
It's not that sound. Normally it's because my surname starts with a B, but now it's just in a minute.
So you just need to press the. But if we can get perhaps just final your reflections on the question, but also the points that Priya raised and your sort of closing final remarks, and if we can do it, perhaps I'm sorry to put you in this position, maybe 2 minutes each. Thank
Sure.
you.
Online questions. Online questions.
Okay, I'm just going to briefly respond to the interventions on the floor and as well as what Priyal said. I can't remember who this quote is by, and I can't remember it exactly, but it's something along the lines of, if you want peace, don't talk to your friends, talk to your enemies. And I think that is certainly now more relevant than it ever has been. So I welcome that intervention. I thought that was quite useful. And in that spirit, then it might be just a tiny drop in the bucket, but the conversation needs to get going. And whether it starts at forums like this and then goes up higher, everything's interconnected. Annette, I don't think anyone has a hardline answer for your intervention, but what I do want to say is that I think citizens sometimes forget their power. And this goes around the world. We might see international law not being respected, but if enough pressure is applied from the ground up, we can see action, we can see progress. So I'm going to pass to my colleagues, and I hope that suffices.
Thank you for your comments. I want to mention some moments about this repairing of international law system. I want to say that maybe this international law is perfect, but we just have to develop an instrument, effective tools to punish those who break the rules. Because Ukraine is a case. From the global point of view, it's just one of a lot of cases. But we can get from there a lot of lessons, and we have to work on these issues on regional and global level. That is the point. Not on national levels, but on only global level will deal with it.
Oh, thank you. There are so many things I would like to say, and I would try to keep it simple, so Dennis, please interrupt me if it's possible. So thank you very much for your interesting questioning regarding negotiations, the difficult questions for us Ukrainians. And then we first have to reflect upon negotiations that we already had in Istanbul at the beginning of war, because they are now in Ukrainian media about those negotiations. If you remember from the Russian side, the person who was leading negotiation is Mr. Medinsky, who is exactly responsible for rewriting history from the Russian side. He was Minister of Education, he published in Russian textbooks, and there is a very interesting footage of him leading the negotiation where he said, our Ukrainian partners do not grasp the concept of denazification. 2 years passed and we still are not grasping the concept of Ukrainians being denazified. Okay, so this is a great problem. So what I'm saying here now, of course, there's a position of the Ukrainian government regarding negotiations with Putin, which is a very difficult point, because for any negotiations there should be some common ground. And I have to praise Putin as a Ukrainian, because he now openly says that Russia wants to keep what he now officially calls territorial acquisitions. So the occupied territories, Putin wants to keep them in Russia. Thank you very much for highlighting another important issue. Issue is that we Ukrainians, when we explain the history of what's going on, I'm really grateful. This is my second praise, which goes to Mr. Putin, is Tucker Carlson interviews. 2 hours explaining why we Ukrainians do not exist and why we Ukrainians have no right to existence. I can tell you my personal story. I'm from Donetsk, the city which is now occupied. I went to school there, I graduated there. I still have some of my extended family living there. I have a Russian surname, but the village my Russian surname ancestor come from in Donetsk Oblast, they speak Ukrainian. This is the part of our story. When I graduated from the only Ukrainian language school in the city of Donetsk in 1999, because I graduated in Ukraine, we call it Golden Medal, which is Magna Cum Laude for A+ GPA score. There was a lady from the City Council on Education controlling our test who asked me this question in Russian. Maxim, you seem to be a clever guy. Tell us, how is it possible to study mathematics and physics in Ukrainian? Her assumption was that Ukrainian language is no good for physics and science and mathematics. I was very caught by surprise in 1999. While I'm telling you the story, we now have these accounts of a lot of accounts in the occupied territories of Ukrainian school children books burned and taken from the libraries. Exactly what it was in Nazi Germany. So there are many difficult issues with our identity. Another example, which I very like a lot. In Russia, if you want to know what the government is thinking, you switch on the federal channels, you follow the propaganda. Why? Because you know that in Russia, for any utterance against Putin, you go to jail. Navalny was killed in prison. Now election, no competition at all. So I'm very proud for Ukrainian people. In the occupied part of Zaporizhia Oblast, Olena showed on the map of the nuclear power plant, is the courageous people were so really courageous to file a petition that in the occupied schools, with the now Russian occupation forces, there should be instruction in the Ukrainian language. And no Russian media, federal media went crazy. Are saying, why do these people want Ukrainian? It does not exist as a language. There is no culture. So it is difficult for us Ukrainians. Of course, we know the position. I do understand your point that having open negotiations, it's important to talk to each other, but we need to at least arrive on some common ground. We Ukrainian, it's a separate topic. I'm glad that we have the audience. You can talk in the break. Alexander Romantsov from the Center for Human Rights and
Center for Civil Liberties.
Civil Liberties, sorry, I'm just a bit nervous, who was granted the Peace Prize, Nobel Peace Prize 2022, and they are working on the Ukrainian deported children who are indoctrinated. There is no Ukraine, you should not be Ukrainian, and children who are punished for speaking Ukrainian, for example. This is horrible stories. So we Ukrainians want to have a common ground of what we are discussing. We think that Ukrainians should be freed We need that Ukrainians, we should have right to our own identity. My first language is Russian, I'm not denying it, and nobody cut my tongue for speaking Ukrainian. The problem was, now to finish my speech, because this is something I found always inspiring. In the Soviet Union, and I believe Soviet Union was an extension of the Russian Empire. The best language was Russian. You as Ukraine had to give up your language, and for us Ukrainians it was easy because we are European looking. And another issue is within Russia, all this national Russian Republic who are non-European looking, like Tversk, Buryatia, all name it, and Caucasian republics who are Muslims, for example, who are extremely oppressed, who are denied their language and culture. But anyway, there's a great Ukrainian dissident, those who fought against the Soviet powers. He was imprisoned for many, many years back in Soviet times, Miroslav Marinovich. And he said that Nelson Mandela was my empowerment, was an example that people around the globe fight for the freedom. And yesterday when I went to Mandela home and to Apartheid Museum, I realized there is something we both share, understanding identity. Nobody can tell you that your languages are not good for studying mathematics and physics. Nobody can tell me as Ukrainian that my language is bad for a non-existent language, and that Ukraine is part of Russian Empire. Sorry for being a bit emotional, but this is something, thank you for asking, that we Ukrainians, even with Russian surnames and Russian-speaking families, we do have this identity. We don't want any country to invade us, and this is something for our discussion. We want to have answering this the question what we can do, what Diana asked. I think for any violation of international law, wherever it be it, Gaza, Ukraine, African continent, anywhere, there should be a mechanism to punish perpetrators, to achieve justice. And when we all cooperate, we do in Ukraine appreciate the news of African delegation. It was viral on Ukrainian news that African continent is helping, is trying to contribute, also trying to understand our condition, our Ukrainian condition. So I think there is a potential, and I do support what Professor Cheryl said. We need to open and broaden this window of opportunities. So thank you for your question. Thank you.
Thank you to everybody, especially your intervention, Creole, and your structure. On the one hand, when I think about wars, wherever they occur, the aggressor, the invader, always seeks to dehumanize the other. And so that is part of what is happening here. There's no doubt that Russia has been doing this. We must not excuse that, right? And that there has to be accountability, as I stressed, for the atrocities that have been committed prior to the war, during the war, and that will still happen post any signing of an agreement. We don't have the kind of accountability mechanisms built into our peace and security structures, and that is part of our challenge to begin with. We have been, as I tried to indicate, speaking about these global governance institutions writ large, but the peace and security architectures in particular as no longer being appropriate. And I think, as I stressed there, I want to reiterate, it is not simply about, yes, it's okay, we must just look at who's sitting at the table. That's not going to change the predicament we are in. And so when you look at the fundamental principles, I say, look, let's look at those international laws that nobody seems to be respecting, etc. Why is this such a holy cow? Why can we not, if people are not respecting, go back and see whether these are still appropriate or not? I'm not saying that we chuck them out, but let's open up for that discussion. On the principle of sovereignty, for example, we in Africa have long been saying that this principle is actually held up by de facto states in African countries to not have others address the atrocities that they're committing within their own states. And so there is this concept of a shared sovereignty, for example, that the world is interdependent, and maybe we should start looking more at the conceptualization of a shared sovereignty. So I'm thinking about those kinds of discussions and how we incorporate that into a transformed multilateral system. The double standards definitely are there. I also wanted to pick up on this thing of mediation. I was reminded of discussions that we used to have around whether the conflict is ripe for resolution. You remember those kinds of discussions. And we could perhaps ask this now. Yes, there needs to be direct negotiations within this particular conflict. If there are parties that still believe that they can win on the battlefield, it is going to be very difficult to shift them in their positions. But from our own experience, the more trust, the more confidence building measures you build in, the more likely it is that they come. And everybody starts off with polarized positions, but you work and you work and you work until you get them closer to accepting. Both sides have to make compromises. That is what mediation is about. And so we need to be getting, moving towards that and finding that common ground. There must be some of that. And so if we just focus on the polarized positions and not on some of the things that we can move this thing forward, I think we're going to get trapped here. Interestingly now, the UN Charter is up for discussion. And so to answer your particular question, we in Africa need to get to what is our thinking, and it shouldn't just be member states. It should be member states and civil society. I guess Europe and all the other continents need to do the same, and then we need a more global conversation around this. I said this in another meeting of this nature. We had the League of Nations. When it was no longer appropriate, we moved to the United Nations. If we are saying that this organ is no longer fit for purpose, then let's have the discussion. It doesn't mean that we throw out everything, but we have the discussion of what needs to be adapted and how are we going to adapt it. But more importantly, who writes the script for that? Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for these reflections. We've reached the end of this event. I just want to briefly mention that there were two other questions mentioned asked in the chat online. Perhaps something for us to consider and discuss. And I really apologize to our participants online for not responding to these. But the questions were in relation to your recommendations with regard to energy production strategy in terms of mixing renewable energy. What are the risks associated with that? And I think it was quite an interesting one. And there was another interesting question about the fact that both Russia and Ukraine, well, allegedly, claim that African people are being drafted into various private military corporations fighting in Ukraine. And the question was essentially, what does it say about Africa? And what should we expect going forward? But colleagues, thank you very much for marvelous discussion. I really enjoyed this conversation. And as we always say, this is not the end of the conversation. We should continue this moving forward. Thank you very much, and thank you.
Thank you for moderating. Thank you.